Welcome back to Liberty Bytes on the Think Liberty Network. I'm your host, William Gadsden. You can follow me personally on Twitter at William_Gadsden and follow Think Liberty on Facebook, Twitter, or whatever your favorite social media outlet is. Give us a follow and a like for updates on new episodes and more. On our last episode, we covered Abraham Lincoln, a president that history, and as a result, the American public, laws as our greatest president, but was in reality anything but. For this episode, we're going to discuss one that is the least spoken about, but one of the most impactful presidents we have had in our history when it comes to the dynamic between the office of the president and the American people themselves. The hero of San Juan Hill, the trust buster, the meddler, Theodore Roosevelt. Compared to the relatively humble beginnings of many of our presidents before him, Theodore Roosevelt was born into a very wealthy family. Born in New York in 1858 to a successful import business owner, Theodore was homeschooled and eventually went on to Harvard and Columbia Law School. But this isn't to say that he always had it easy. As a young boy, Theodore struggled with illness and asthma, something that he had to work hard to overcome. As a young man, Theodore Roosevelt quickly entered the political scene, first in the New York State Assembly, then as Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Navy under President McKinley, after a brief stint in the Dakota Territories as a cowboy. But his true claim to fame came after leading the Rough Riders in the Spanish-American War, and is leading the charge up San Juan Hill, which modern military archaeologists say is more of a legend than truth. After being nominated for the Congressional Medal of Honor, Roosevelt was elected governor of New York in 1898. Now, all of this background is well and good, but what we really came here to talk about today is how he impacted American politics as a whole, and the American presidency in particular. After the assassination of President McKinley in 1901, Vice President Roosevelt suddenly found himself ascending to the position of President of the United States. He took to the new position with aplomb, marrying the office with his additional role of leader of the new progressive movement. The new president went on a rampage of trust-busting and government spending in a flurry that presumably gave John Maynard Keynes let's just say he would have been proud. Liberal use of the Sherman Antitrust Act, the first antitrust law in the U.S., massively expanding the size of the U.S. Navy, and meddling with foreign affairs in Central and South America with the thinly veiled promise to use force if not satisfied with the results. He also pushed his square deal policy, ushering in a new era of government regulation in the American economy in the name of helping the working class. The fact that the name Square Deal sounds eerily similar to several other familiar programs throughout our history is no coincidence. This marriage of sharp marketing and federal expansionism was merely the first of many. Wilson's New Freedom, FDR's New Deal, Truman's Fair Deal, JFK's New Frontier, and of course LBJ's Great Society. In other words, Teddy was the worst parts of neoconservatives and democratic socialists, pushing for government intervention in both the foreign and domestic scenes. But perhaps his greatest accomplishment is one that doesn't really go noticed outside of political science classes. Roosevelt was known as a boisterous and charismatic speaker. Roosevelt, using this to his political advantage whenever possible, would, most of the time, essentially browbeat people until he got what he wanted. In doing so, he created what we now know as the bully pulpit. Essentially, the bully pulpit is a tactic in which the president uses the American public as leverage against Congress if legislators aren't acting in accordance with the president's agenda. Now, obviously, most of those in Congress have to be reelected more often than the president does. This is something that I addressed in the previous Liberty Bytes episode. But because of this, Roosevelt understood that he could threaten the re-election of legislators that he didn't agree with by speaking directly to the American people themselves. In doing so, he could keep Congress in line, or under his thumb. Now, Roosevelt used this to his advantage on several occasions, traveling across the country, giving speeches in support of bills that backed his particular agenda, and speaking to the people directly or through the press, urging them to pressure their legislators to support certain bills, and for the people to cease their support of their own legislators if those legislators failed to deliver on the bill at hand. The bully pulpit has been used by presidents ever since, from the use of radio to television and finally the internet. After all, why should the president bear the burden of defending his own agenda when he can simply make promises to the people themselves and blame Congress if the bills don't go through or if he doesn't get the results that he wants? Taking a page from Jackson's book and writing several of his own, Roosevelt sought to vastly expand the powers of the president and arm himself with the power of the American voter in order to pursue his own agenda and defend his own gains. However, unlike Jackson and Lincoln, Roosevelt didn't even use a time of national crisis to justify his actions. He did so even more brazenly, using national purpose and promise of strong leadership and direction to justify his actions. Many years after his term as president, Roosevelt himself expressed the following, quote, "My belief was that it was not only his, the president's, right but his duty to do anything that the nation demanded unless action was forbidden by the Constitution or by the laws. Under this interpretation of executive power, I did and caused to be done many things not previously done by the president and the heads of the departments. I did not usurp power, but I did greatly broaden the use of executive power. In other words, I acted for the public welfare. I acted for the common well-being of all our people, wherever and in whatever manner was necessary, unless prevented by direct constitutional or legislative means. While he denies having usurped power, I personally fail to see any difference between usurping power and expanding presidential power based on an interpretation of presidential authority. Now, all of these arguments aside, under this interpretation and expansion of power, Roosevelt set the stage for the largest expansion of federal power in the name of social and economic welfare that we have seen in our entire history. One of the most important bills that were passed under his closely watching eye was that of the Hepburn Act of 1906, which further enhanced the power of the Interstate Commerce Commission to unilaterally regulate the domestic economy, especially concerning shipping. And now, as if that weren't enough, Roosevelt also spearheaded the effort to federalize land and regulate the use of natural resources in the U.S., using executive orders to federalize millions of acres of land across the continent and denying the people access to some of the richest sources of natural resources that we have in this country. Today, the federal government controls about 640 million acres of land. That's about 28% of the country. All in all, while Theodore Roosevelt is often celebrated as a war hero, a man's man, and perhaps the most famous conservationist in history, the reality is far more stark. This man set the stage, indeed the standard, for the largest expansions of federal power in the U.S., the grandfather of big government and U.S. interventionism throughout the world. Thanks for joining us, and I hope you'll come back next week as we cover my favorite socialist president to rant about, the president that has brought more destruction to our country through authoritarianism than any other, Theodore Roosevelt's own cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. As always, stay tuned to become more liberty-centered with us. I'm William Gadsden with Think Liberty.